Welcome to the program. Glad to have you today. We have some fun topics that we're going to discuss, and they're primarily related to finance and some things that you might have seen going on the Twitterverse or the Metasphere or something like that, wherever you encounter your social media and your controversial takes. We're going to go through some of those today. I think it's good to look at some of these things, and really the focus is going to be on dispelling fact from fiction and seeing that there is kind of this running strand of victimization going on and a victim mentality that is quite odd, very characteristic of, well, a specific kind of people, the left, for quite some time, and those who seek to garner the sympathy of others in order to push what they believe forward. But it's been being used recently, rather interestingly, by those on the right, or those who claim to be on the right, even those who claim to be Christians. And it's a very odd thing, but I want to get into that today and really look at some things and dispel some commonly believed myths, almost this sort of national myth, this economic myth that's starting to develop amongst millennials specifically, and the younger people, the generation after, the little Zoomer babies, but also just showcase kind of the reality of the world, looking at it from a standpoint of truth and not just a standpoint of outrage, because the outrage is rather annoying. It really is. If you have nothing to be outraged about, you're just outraged because you're ignorant and you know how to string together some words that seem like they form a coherent sentence but actually don't support a common thesis of truth that's based in truth, then outrage is kind of your only thing that you're gonna move to. So I guess we can start to move in that direction and see how it goes, and hopefully this is helpful. So the first thing to hit, we've had high interest rates for a few years now, right? After the whole debacle of the Fed, the Federal Reserve, and the Feds, right? The federal government, as well as nearly all state governments and nearly all governments around the world shutting off the economy in the winter and spring of 2020 through however long you want to, it was pertinent to you that it was shut off, whether for several weeks, several months, even up until, right, there were restrictions that were only removed in 2023. The world was essentially turned off and turned back on. And what happened with that was interest rates got moved from increasing as they were at the end of 2019. There was the risk of some sort of repo crisis with cash shortages and whatnot with banks, to going from wherever we were, the mid threes or something like that, for the Fed fund rate, down to zero, and back down into that zero and sub-zero area that we knew for most of the 2010s. That happened overnight and pushed interest rates to zero, right, and below. It pushed mortgage rates from the fours down back into the low threes, even the twos, depending on the term you financed and whatnot. And it made lending super easy, right? It made borrowing super easy for those who wanted to do home improvements, who wanted to get into the stock market on leverage, who wanted to invest in capital expansions for their businesses and so forth. And ultimately, that low interest rate environment, plus a massive injection of trillions of dollars worth of cash and other foreign currencies and economies all across the globe, led to the astonishing growth in the stock market that we have today. But more immediately back then, the astonishing growth of the housing market and the increase in prices that we saw nearly overnight and ran on a very, very long bull run for a couple years, 2-3 years, right? And now we have higher interest rates that began in 2022, if I remember correctly, and have been starting to get cut, right? But we're still in the fours kind of a deal, high threes, low fours. and mortgage rates having jumped up to into the sevens, are back down into the low sixes, high fives. So, but prices haven't dropped necessarily as much. They've really plateaued from where they were, and so we have these houses that people bought whenever it was. The trough of the market for the housing market was 2011, 2013, about then. And it started to pick up and grew at a reasonable rate. Certainly wasn't expensive before the whole shutdown situation before 2020. But we saw housing nearly double in a lot of instances, in a lot of places, from 2019 or so into 2020, 2021. And people go, wow, you know what? I have all this equity now. My house is worth so much. That's great. Cool. I got all this cash saved up in my house. I might as well sell and either downgrade into something smaller or do an expansion because I have all this money and rates are cheap, or just refinance. Just sit in that house that they've owned for 10 years and now they've refinanced it to a 10, 15-year term. It's like 2.5%. Their payment is under $1,000 a month, kind of a deal. But people freaked out when they were buying, going, the price of a house is so expensive, man. It was like, it was like 300 grand, 250, 300 in 2018, 2019 for this, 3 bed, 2 bath kind of a deal. 2,000, 2,500 square feet. And now this same house is worth 550, 650. What happened? Well, a lot of people right now want to blame the unaffordability of housing on boomers, which is such a weird take. It's a very strange take. Now I understand where they're coming from, right? There is this monicum of truth that those from the baby boomer generation, right, who were born post World War II up until the mid 60s, own a lot of housing, and that's very true. They bought houses. The average age to buy a house back in the day when they were coming into adulthood was in the 20s, right? They were in the low 20s. And now the average age of buying your first home is 40. So these older adults, the elderly now, as we would call them, seniors, have owned their houses for quite some time, right? And there is this predominant view that there is a shortage of housing, which, if you go to rural Kansas, there's no shortage of housing, because a shortage of housing doesn't mean you can buy a house for $20,000 to $30,000, which is very realistic in a lot of the Midwest, right? Now, there's no shortage there because who wants to live there? Honestly, that very small town feel, middle of nowhere. Your nearest large city is like Wichita or something like that, and even then, that's 2 hours away. That's not a life a lot of people want to live. They want the metropolitan life. They want that cosmopolitan life, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I live in a suburb of Phoenix, and this is the place that I enjoy. It's where I grew up. I'm happy here. I don't want to live in the middle of nowhere. And rural life doesn't sound very interesting to me. That's why I wouldn't move to Globe. You can get a lot of cheap housing in Globe, in Arizona or Miami or Superior, but it doesn't have the amenities. My family's not there. The community that I've built, the church that I go to and serve at, is not there. Not the life I want to live. But in my area, certainly housing costs have increased. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars for a starter home. 400 grand probably is fair, between $300,000 and $400,000 for a starter home. And the reason prices are high and there's this perceived shortage, right, is because people want to live in these suburban areas, in the cities as well, and that drives up the cost, right? The demand is high, the supply shrinks because people want to live there. And even though you might be like, Jeremiah, go look on Zillow, there's like tons of cities for sale in Phoenix or in Austin or in LA or this, that, and the other place. It's like, yeah, that's fine. But the people who are moving and selling their homes aren't moving out rurally. They're moving either across town to some other suburb, or they're moving to another metro, whether it's relocating from LA to Texas because the company's headquarters moved, kind of a deal. So the supply doesn't have a chance of catching up per se, but there isn't such a shortage that it's unaffordable, that people can't live in these areas, right? Or else it's a fallacy in and of itself, because if you were like, there's such a housing shortage, no one can afford to live in these cities, be like, well, then where are all the poor people? Why is there rampant poverty in a lot of these cities? Oh, they're just renting. Perhaps they're just renting, but if they are just renting, how can they afford rent if you're saying there's a housing shortage? If the house is expensive, then the landlord's going to sell it instead of collecting, you know, $1,500 a month. If he can get 600 grand, it's strange. It's a kind of a strange view. So, housing shortage, sure. The supply has been constrained so that the demand is pushing the cost of housing upwards, right? Makes sense. But when you look at it, you can't look at it from, this is where the victim mentality comes in. You can't just look at it being like, all right, that house that you bought, I'll take myself for an example. The house that I bought, I paid a pretty penny for. You can go, whatever, figure that out eventually. But I paid a substantial amount of money, substantially more than the couple who owned the house paid for it. Now, they bought the house shortly after it was built. My house was built in the late 70s. They bought it in the early 80s. They were the second owner, and they owned it through then, right? And it was their starter home. They bought it, raised their kids here. Kids left. Kids had kids. Now they're trying to go be close to grandkids. So they moved away. And this goes back to the shortage. They moved from Mesa out to Queen Creek. So they didn't move rurally. They moved to another metro that's growing and decided to sell their home here. Now, they paid under $100,000 for this house, right? And when they sold it, they made, 6-7 times what they paid for the house. That's what they sold it for. And good for them, kind of a deal, right? They held on to it. That's a long-term investment. But when we consider what they paid for it to begin with and how that relates to their income and how the interest rates that they got related to the payment that they were making, yeah, they made a killer, but where does it come into play of should they have kept it and just nearly had it paid off? Maybe they did some renovations and stuff like that. They had a small mortgage on the place, but the interest rates when they sold it 2022 were fantastic for them. They could have refinanced, right? And I believe they did. Got a 3% or a sub 3% home loan on something that they only owed under $100,000 for. That's an insane payment. Even if you do a 10-year loan, it's not a very expensive payment. But they had priorities, so they left. Now, am I crying? Am I crying because I have a mortgage and I paid substantially more than what they paid for it? No, that's stupid. I don't need to waste my time trying to be a victim when I willingly entered into the agreement to purchase the house that they were selling. I'm not the victim in this case. I willfully chose to buy this house. And I had the finances to afford it. Now, where it comes into play, right, with cost of living and the adjusting standards of that, everybody today wants to make it out to be that housing is so unaffordable. It's never been this unaffordable, which is so strange, especially when it comes from millennials, right, talking about that, who were generally born. You get conflicting reports as to what a generation is. I think a 20-year span is the best look at a generation, which throws some things off conventionally, but it doesn't really matter. But millennials who were born in the 80s through up until 2000, early 2000s, those in the older portion of millennials were born when their parents, the Gen X and the boomers, right, young boomers, and any age of Gen X, right, were moving into their first homes in the 80s, hence like these people that I bought my house from, and they had their kids, and they bought these homes, and sure, 80 grand, 70 grand, 40 grand, 30 grand, 100 grand, something like that, in that range, depending on where they lived. If they would have been out here in Mesa, a much smaller market at the time, growing for sure, yes, but definitely not a sprawling metro like LA, New York City, any other large city at the time that was growing and growing and growing, and had housing already somewhat more expensive than the national average. But the rate that they paid, right? Sure, they bought it for 70, 80 grand, but man, the interest rate that they had, 8%. You're like, oh, 8%, we're in the sixes. Yeah, we're in the sixes for sure. But an extra 2 percentage points, 200 basis points, to sound like a finance chat kind of a guy, that's insane. That's a lot of money per month. And when you look at the rate of of what they spent on their housing payment per month compared to what it is now, here it is. 40 years ago, if you bought a house, right, the average price, median home price was $83,200. Average income, median income, excuse me, there's a difference, right? $23,620 a year. You're going, wow, that's a lot of difference. Versus today, the average house price is $468, and the average or the median income is $74,580 a year. You're like, man, housing's outpaced the growth of income. Yeah, but let's look at the payments. In 1985, their interest rates were actually 12 to 13%, and that was somewhat of an anomaly, right? The average interest rate generally for a mortgage has been in the eights. In the early 2000s, it was that way. In the late 90s, in the 70s, before the whole massive inflation issue of Carter that ran through Reagan, interest rates were definitely lower, but not necessarily as low as we have been accustomed to, being in the threes or fours. That's relatively unseen in history. So you buy that home, you buy that $83,200 home, right? But you're paying 12, 13% on your mortgage. Even though you put 20% down, you're paying 35% of your income. That's pre-tax, right? That's median income. That's pre-tax for your housing payment. 1985, 40 years ago. Now, what do you do today? Sure, you got a 6% interest rate. You're buying a $468,000 home. Awesome. Good for you. You put 20% down. Percent of your annual income pre-tax, right, that's going toward your mortgage payment is 36%. 36%. 1 percentage point difference, 1.5% percentage points difference for out of your total income. You might say, wow, housing is extraordinarily expensive now, if you compare it to 40 years ago. No, the answer is it's not. The payment is quite affordable. The price looks a lot different, as well as the median income that homeowners are making, or the average person is making. But the cost of housing is not a lot different. Now you might say, Jeremiah, 20% down on $468,000 is a substantial amount of money you have to put down versus 20% on $83,000. Sure, the percentage difference there is substantial, yes. Absolutely. But it's not much more than a year's worth of annual income, whereas back in the 80s, it would have been a little over a year's, right, a little under a year's worth of annual income. So there's a little discrepancy there, for sure. Different financing terms, FHA loans, if you're a veteran, you have to put like 1% down. There's a lot of different financing rates or methods today for housing that'll get you a home with lower than 20% interest. I know you have to pay the P&I and all of that stuff, but it doesn't matter, right? We're trying to compare apples to apples as much as we can. And we have, right, Fuji apples compared with Granny Smiths. That's as close as we're going to be able to get. They're still apples. We're still talking about housing. So when people go, wow, look at the difference that, housing is millennials today as they're trying to buy their first home versus their parents when they bought their first home 40 years ago. I'm going, what are we complaining about? It costs the exact same amount. If we go back, though, to 2020, 2019, and before, between 2011, trough of the market, 2011, 2013, to 2019, 2020, and we're looking at the cost of housing then, My goodness, that was the golden era to buy a house. If anyone should be complaining, it's complaining that people who bought houses then are holding on to their homes when they have such a substantial amount of equity. And not only do they have such a substantial amount of equity, they also have crazy low interest rates. Crazy low interest rates. And you see people like that all the time, right? They bought their homes, they started a family around then or whatnot, got a good job out of college, and were able to afford a house, whether in a nice metro or a suburb before it sprawled out too crazy. It's just called planning. If you plan and you have goals, you're going to be able to actually accomplish what you have. And if you don't have a plan and you're not getting the goals that you think you might want to have or that you're peer pressured into kind of a deal, or then you're just going to become this victim and you're going to complain about it. It's very annoying. It's actually very annoying to do this. Such as this example, this lady talking about in 99 when she was born, or she was a baby. I don't know when she was born, but I presume around then. Her parents bought a nice house in Evergreen, Colorado. Maybe you've seen this, maybe you haven't. Now, Evergreen is in the mountains just outside of Denver. Very nice house. They paid $350 for that house in 99. Now, that's your first red flag. $350 in 99. If the average or the median home price today is $480, that house then was not a starter home. It was a luxury home, right? It was a nice home. And now they're complaining about how the system is rigged against young families when this year they sold that home and they sold it in March on the 17th of 25. They sold that home for $1.25 million. Now, here's the thing with Colorado. The peak of their market hit a couple years ago. I'm sure that the price on that house has gone down at least good 10-15% because the market was hot then when the interest rates were low and people who had money were moving out there buying these $1 million homes with 3% interest rates and paying obscenely low mortgages. Good for them. But now, with a 6% interest rate on a $1.2 million home, a little crazy, right? The payment on that is $6,000. Now that's a little crazy. But here, listen to this. The payment on your 1999 mortgage for your mortgage, right? Buying a $350,000 house like her parents did, that payment then was $2,055. $2,055 in 1999. That's substantial. That's a substantial amount of money, right? A lot of people today don't even have a mortgage that's that expensive. And right, this is with 20% down in both instances. And my first home, let me share this with you. When I bought my first home, 2018, I bought it for $295, right? So relatively close. My payment for that was $1,600 at 4%, 4.75% interest. That was my mortgage rate. And that was in 2018, right? 19 years later, and my payment is only slightly less. And the first home that I bought was less expensive than her parents bought. So there's something a little wrong. When she's complaining about the system being rigged, well, it doesn't seem that she's portraying something that's actually true or accurate, genuine. So now here's where the fun part is, right? The payment, like I said, is $6,000 on that interest, potentially if they didn't buy the loan down, due points, stuff like that, on that loan for that $1.25 million house today. If you adjust the payment in 1999 to dollars today, $1999 to $2025, the payment goes from $2,055 to $4,006. That's an expensive house payment. Now, it's not as expensive as $6,000, but if you compare it, saying the increase in the cost of that mortgage has only grown 50% in 26 years, that's a pretty reasonable growth rate. That's a very reasonable growth rate. Now, it looks like a lot, right? Because the house value nearly quadrupled, went from 350,000 to 1.25 million. That's a great return. Good for them. Got a lot of equity out of that. hopefully, and are set up and get the care that they need if they're retiring and moving into something smaller, paying medical bills, stuff like that. Good for them. But man, that's an expensive payment that they were making back in the day, especially as it's compared to today's dollars. So her complaint of something truly evil about how the system is rigged against today's young families is ridiculous. It's unfound, right? It isn't even logical, these statements that are being made. And that's the sad thing is people see how they see that they can't afford something like that, and they look around and be like, man, that's the average price of a house today, when in reality it's not the average price of a house, right? You can buy starter homes, condos, for under 300,000 in the threes in most metros, most expensive metros like a Phoenix, maybe not in LA, but there is more reasonable housing options. But the cost of living certainly differs, right? And that's something to be noted. So there's like this victim mentality and this going after boomers, and the very right, the other strange thing. So it's like, all right, they're hogging all of the housing supplies, and they're not selling them, so the price is obscene. No one's talking about interest rates because no one understands that. They just understand that they're, the difference between 1.25 and 350,000 for some reason. They understand the actual cost of home ownership, which is probably why they're making ignorant posts like this, because they don't even understand what home ownership is and what goes into it. But the other thing that they're going after the baby boomers is on property taxes, and how they have exemptions in a lot of states, right? Or credits or reductions on the amount of property taxes they have to pay once you're over 65. And people just going after them saying, this one says the first property tax in American history was levied in 1634. By 1800, local governments in every single state collected property taxes. You're only hearing calls to abolish property taxes now because they're the last obligation boomers have to society. It's a very strange thing. Many things wrong with this post. Number one, when did paying taxes become some sort of prestigious, valiant, noble thing? It's not. If you don't pay your taxes, the government comes to you with guns drawn and says, you're going to pay your taxes or you're going to go to jail. It's not a noble thing. It 100% is not a noble thing. It's done under compulsion. Paying taxes is done under compulsion. Thus, something done under compulsion cannot be noble. It's a very strange thing. Number two, something that has arisen in the last 400 years and in universally in the 1800s, 200 years ago, is now somehow seen as something valiant, something normal. It's even something that's developed in American history. American history, you can't say the 1700s because property taxes didn't exist universally at that time among the states when they declared independence. So he's pushing even further, right? Now, be it 1800 is different than 1776 and, right, the Constitution 1783 and whatnot. It's fine. But it's a strange thing that he states these facts, and now he's saying the call to abolish property taxes is actually something that is affecting me and is only helping those who are boomers. It doesn't make any sense. So you want people to pay taxes for some reason? What is that doing? How is that something that's noble? When you pay property taxes, you essentially are paying a lease for your property, whether you own it or not, whether you still have a mortgage or not. You're paying the state for your land. Is there something good about that? Is there something good about not ever being able to fully own your property? Because if you don't pay it, the state's going to come and say, well, you haven't paid your property taxes. Goodbye. Time to leave. This is ours. It denotes that the land is never truly yours when there's a tax on it. If the state truly controls the land. So let me rephrase it this way. When you pay property taxes, and the state can come and take your property when you don't pay your taxes, you don't actually own your land. The land ultimately belongs to the state. You're paying a usage fee on it. Now people try to be noble and be like, yeah, but it's for fire and education and, defense and stuff like that. It's like, so what's your point? It's not yours. If you have to pay those things, it's not yours. You're paying an HOA then. And who likes that? Who enjoys that? Sure, it's nice to have, all the garbage cans, out of the street 2 days after the garbage man comes, or not having crazy colors on your houses or lights up all year long. But is it really worth it? You're paying a usage fee. You don't actually own what you think you own. How would that be if you owned a vehicle, right? Now you have to pay for title, right? You have to register your vehicle, and you pay an annual title to have license plates to drive the vehicle. But if you don't pay that, your vehicle doesn't get repossessed. If I don't pay for my license and registration on my truck, the government isn't gonna come and repossess my vehicle. Now, if I go out and drive it while it doesn't have plates, yeah, I run that risk. But if it's just sitting in my house, sitting in my driveway, that's not going to happen. But for a home, you don't pay your property taxes, government can repossess your property. That doesn't seem very right. That doesn't seem like a great power to give a government. That's just me. So, saying that boomers are trying to get rid of the last obligation they have to society, okay, good. If they're trying to do that, good for them. Should they have an obligation to society like that? No. No one should. That's stupid. No one should have an obligation like that. Should exceptions be carved out for certain people? I don't believe so. That's not equal and just measures and weights. Property taxes, just like an income tax, should be levied on all or none. And if it's levied on all, that doesn't make it just. It makes it appropriate, it makes it fair, but it doesn't make it just. Taxes are not just, right? Now, to say I'm an anarchist is incorrect. There has to be some method of collecting a tax in order to fund a state. That is true. But should everything be taxed? No. And perhaps the best means of doing that is some sort of use tax, some sort of sales tax. No, that's a debate for another day. So people whine, people complain about property taxes, people complain about boomers, and it even goes further. Right, we're in a demographic cliff, right? We are in America. We are somewhat fine because we have high levels of immigration, which we'll discuss that in just a little bit as well. But birth rates are falling globally, and they have been. Even in the highest birth rate nations like Chad, Democratic Republic of the Congo, those Central African countries, they're seeing birth rates fall from where it was in the 8s, now it's down to 6. And you're seeing all across Europe, all across Asia, all across North and South America, birth rates plummet below 2.1, which is the replacement level, right, to keep a steady population, and falling even lower into the ones, sub 1 even. Ukraine, South Korea, Hong Kong, those are all examples of places that have sub 1 birth rate. So less than one child is born to each woman who is of childbearing years, right? 16 to, or 14 to 45 or whatever their metric is for that. Insane, number one. That's how you collapse civilizations. Number two, there is this strange, odd belief that property taxes, the elimination of property taxes somehow hurts families from having children. Now, you heard that correctly. Having taxes eliminated hurts, especially on seniors, people from having children. That's a very odd statement. Now, the reason they believe this is because somehow, well, let's just read this. In a world of low birth rates, eliminating property taxes is a bad idea. Young people are already at a financial disadvantage and have a hard time buying a house suitable for a family. Okay. Meanwhile, older Americans pay much less in taxes and receive the lion's share of benefits. Now, again, multiple issues with this. Obviously, older Americans pay much less in taxes. They're not as high of earners, especially if they're elderly and retired. No duh, right? No duh. Lion's share of benefits. Well, what kind of benefits are we talking about? Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, um, other entitlements that they have, in theory, paid into, right? Isn't that how that works? Um, I'm sure they're not saying fire and police services. That would be an odd, strange thing to say. But what other benefits are they getting? Are they comparing the benefits that younger Americans are getting when they're going to community college, which are subsidized, right, by property taxes? It's a very odd, strange thing. Very odd, strange thing. So they're saying families somehow are disadvantaged because housing is so expensive, and housing is expensive when property taxes are eliminated. That's a farce. That is absolutely a farce. So we have to keep property taxes in order to promote fertility. That somehow promotes fertility. Now, that's stupid, in all honesty. It's stupid. Because this is directly in our response to Ron DeSantis, right, governor of Florida, as of this time, saying we want to eliminate all property taxes, and he's not going to carve out exceptions. Now, that's a man of principle. Saying we're going to do this, and we're going to get rid of it. Property taxes are wrong. You don't actually own your property. Wholly agree with that. But somehow saying we're going to eliminate all property taxes is bad for fertility, bad for the growth rate of future generations and families wanting to have kids. How does that even make sense? It doesn't. It doesn't. The view that you can incentivize people to have children through financial means is completely and utterly wrong. We go back to many countries, Russia, Eastern European countries, Hungary, that have tried to incentivize through tax breaks, tax credits, tax eliminations, families to have children, and they don't have children. The birth rates tick up slightly, but they don't stay sustained. And the comical part even is that the best thing for birth rates, right, is a city winning the Super Bowl, right? A city's team winning the Super Bowl, or a country's team winning the World Cup. That's where you see little blips in the increase in fertility. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? Not reducing property taxes, not eliminating property taxes for the young while increasing them on the elderly. That's stupid. That's not equitable, number one. Number two, it's ridiculously stupid. So we have this complaint, and we have this common enemy that's being created out of thin air for some reason, because people like to be the victim and they don't actually understand how the world works. Now we have the baby boomers who are retiring, and they are the enemies because they hold on to property. Well, isn't that interesting? Doesn't that sound a whole lot like Marxism? Doesn't that sound a whole lot like some sort of communistic ideology that's developing, where the bourgeois, right, is the elderly, and the working class, right, those struggling and oppressed are the young. That's ridiculous. Everybody knows, and this is extraordinarily clear, it is wholly clear in the birth rates as seen in Israel, right? Fertility is directly related to culture. And what is directly related to culture? Religion. Religion is the headstream of all these things that go downhill. Politics, fertility, culture, economics, so on and so forth, values. If you want your country to grow, if you want your population to grow and fertility to rise, then you have to make it a value. You have to affect the culture. And the culture now, especially in this globalistic world that we live in and this globalistic culture that has developed in recent decades, is that families are not valued. Money is the only thing that is valued. Thus, the elimination of families is something that is noble, because jobs and working, modern day slavery in many instances, is somehow this noble thing to pursue. Very odd thing. So we have to go after and blame, the boomers. Now here's the funniest part. Here is the funniest part. If you look at billionaires, right, and you look at the wealth that they own, the people who are the wealthiest individuals, doesn't mean they have the most money, right? They own the most, some sort of property, whether it's stocks, bonds, shares in companies, actual property, real estate, and whatnot. And you compare their average net worth, it isn't the boomers. Surprise, surprise, who are the wealthiest? Their average net worth for these billionaires, again, this is billionaires, so take this as you will, is $4.61 billion. The average wealth for a Gen X billionaire, 4.46. Oh, look, a drop down. What about the silent generation? 5.56. Wow, that's a lot. So the silent generation being their parents, not very many of them left, right? If they were born between in the mid 20s to the mid 40s, a lot of those individuals have died off. Those would be like my grandparents, my great grandparents even, but they were a little older than that. They would have been in the greatest generation, not the silent generation, but like Warren Buffett, Rupert Murdoch, very wealthy men who have been around a very long time. They have the largest average wealth actually out of anyone. But who comes in at number 2? Not boomers, millennials. Average wealth of a millennial billionaire, $5.12 billion. $5.12 billion. That's $500 million more than the boomer billionaires average. Isn't that interesting? So is there all this I don't know, this concentration of wealth in boomers' hands? Sure, there is. But the issue ultimately is that the wealth is concentrated into the hands of the wealthy. Now that seems very obvious when you say it, but people don't seem to understand that. And in the economy that we live in today, and that we have lived in for a long time, is an inflationary economy. Now, you might be like, well, things were so much more affordable in the 90s or the early 2000s. I could get a bar of chocolate for, 33 cents. I could get a Hershey's, and now it costs me $1.25. Sure, but compared to 20, 30 years prior to that, it was not that same cost. Inflation has been occurring since essentially the advent of the Fed, right? 1916, I believe that is. We should look that up. We should make sure that it is that it is 1960. It's 1913. Excuse me. Inflation has essentially been running since then, without deflation. Now, in the 30s there was deflation, and that was somewhat of a reset to an extent. But coming out of that, it's just been up. We have rarely ever seen deflation. Deflation helps the saver. It doesn't help the investor. The investor wants inflation because he wants asset prices to increase. So, in the environment that we live in right now, the economic system is inflationary, meaning the wisest thing to do is to purchase assets because they are going to increase in value over time. Now, I'm not saying go buy a house, again, in the middle of Kansas, out in the middle of nowhere, and expect that to be an insane return. You have to buy assets that are desired. Okay? Now, they will increase naturally, right? But if you want to actually make a good amount of money, you have to buy places that are going to grow as well and be desired as well. Same with stock. You can't just buy any stock. So, In an inflationary environment, when you own assets, such as like we saw with 2020, 2021, when rates went sub zero, back to zero again, those assets increased in price substantially from what they had been purchased for in prior years. The money that was made available to those who owned assets were able to buy new assets. The wealthy got wealthier, obviously. What should have happened is people who had enough wealth, enough income to purchase property, should have purchased property. And they today would see their wealth having increased. See, it's the same as these boomers that we're complaining about who bought houses in the 80s. Wow, why did things go up so much? Inflation. That's just how it is. That's the environment that we live in. We keep printing money. It's always going to increase. The Fed targets a rate of inflation of 2 to 2.5% per year. So it naturally wants prices to increase overall of 2 to 2.5%. Now, that means that things are going to increase in the long term. So if you buy not obviously assets that depreciate, such as you have to maintain them, right? But not like a car. Don't buy a car and be like, I bought this Honda Civic for 20 grand and I'm expecting it to be 40 grand when I sell it. You're using it. There's depreciation that comes in on it off of its use. It's not the same like a house, like property, where there is that residual value that is going to increase. So buying property is your best bet right now. Until we have a change in our economic system, that is the best bet. Absolutely the best bet. The best thing to do. And I guarantee you this. If we have the same environment, economic environment that we have today, same system, in 30 years, when you have children, if you have children, because a lot of people are not having children, which is a detriment to society and civilization. If you have children and your kids are trying to get jobs and trying to buy their first homes, who are they going to come after? They're going to be crying about millennials. Oh, millennials. They own all the property because all of their parents died who were boomers and bequeathed them all of this property in their wills, in their trusts. Oh, what are they going to do with them? Oh, they're not just going to sell all of the property, right? Even though they're in their 60s? What? What a strange thing. How sad. The other issue, right, that people bring up, and this is a semi-legitimate issue to bring up, is that of immigration. The American population continues to increase because of immigration substantially. Absolutely. 100% true. The illegal immigration, right, the illegal aliens that reside in this country they have to live somewhere, so they take up space in housing, whether that's through ownership or through renting, which takes spaces away from others and artificially props up the cost of housing, yes, and the cost of renting, yes. So reducing that in the country would have a deflationary effect. Absolutely. Unless it's replaced by immigrants, right? A one-for-one kind of a deal. They're also lower income generally, illegal aliens, right? So getting rid of them is going to open up a lot of communities that are poorer to live in. And I don't think that's what people are crying about, wanting to go live in, the rough part of Phoenix, the rough part of Atlanta, the rough part of LA. Being like, man, if we just got rid of all these illegal aliens, we'd have all this housing. Yeah, you would have all this housing. Would you want to live in those places, though? Is that where you're desiring to buy a home right now? Because I can guarantee you there's a decent amount that is already available for sale and for rent in those places. Now, I'm not saying keep the illegal aliens here. Absolutely, I'm not saying that. I'm saying you're complaining about something that is not actually the issue. The ultimate issue is that you want to live somewhere that a lot of other people want to live. And it's more expensive than it used to be to live in that place. That's just the reality of life. Welcome to living. Congratulations. You will also die. You will also pay taxes. Isn't that interesting? You're not special. But the other target, especially on the right, has been H-1B1 visas, right? Primarily these Indians who are getting brought over to do tech jobs, who are truck drivers, who are doing other skilled labor jobs in our country, as opposed to hiring Americans for those same positions. Now, I hesitate to comment on this because it is such a small number of individuals, but it is also being seen as a scapegoat and as an enemy. And there's an odd angle that it goes at as well, of like, you know what, we're fine with immigrants, but we want them from Europe. We want Norwegians to come over instead of Indians, or we want the French to come over. God forbid, that would be horrible. Instead of the Chinese. Number one, we're talking about people coming from poor nations that do not have a high standard of living to one that has one of the highest standards of living in the entire world. And you want to replace it with people coming from nations that have a comparable or slightly lower standard of living coming to our nation. Why would that happen? That doesn't make any sense. Number two, they cry about their religious and their cultural, syncretisms, their beliefs that they bring over, which is different from what we believe in our culture that we have here. Perfectly valid, right? We want to bring people over who want to become Americans, not Indians who want America to become India. It's fair. Just as you wouldn't want Americans to go over to India and make India America. That's not how it is. Different culture, different people. That's fine to have separate peoples. Perfectly fine. But to say, well, we don't want those dirty Indians, but you know what we do want? We do want those lovely Norwegians. No, that is dumb. Why would you want those Norwegians? These Norwegians do not have the same values as Americans do. Not one bit at all. Not one bit at all. They immigrated right in the 1800s because they wanted a better life. They didn't have opportunity that was back home. They were oppressed by their government. They're not looking for the same things. They have plenty of opportunity. They have one of the world's largest, if not the world's largest, national fund that invests in their oil and gas industry. Has over $1 trillion in it. It's insane. It has one of the highest standards of living in the entire world. Norway does. And just because they're white, they look like the majority of Americans do, doesn't mean that they have our culture. Not one bit at all. They are highly leftist, and socialistic. If you look at how they would vote in the 2024 election when it was Trump versus Harris, the Nords, the Nordic people, would have voted the highest proportion for Kamala Harris. Denmark, right? My family hails from Denmark. Over 100 years ago, they came over. 96% of those surveyed would have voted for Harris. 4% for Trump. Do you want to bring those people in and give them a pathway to citizenship so that they can vote, Mr. Right-Wing Man, Mr. MAGA? Finland, 90%. Part of Scandinavia, Nordic. Sweden, 90%. Norway, 86%. 86%. Why would you want to bring those people in? Just because they look like you? But they have values that are highly differentiated than you? I don't hear you saying, let's bring over the white Californians who are rabid leftists into my community. That's the same thing that you're doing. Just because it's like saying, I want to import, and this is what a lot of, like, Texas is doing this, Florida is doing this, even Arizona is doing this. It's infuriating. Let's bring in Silicon Valley. Let's move these companies over and have them relocate to our states. Why? Let's incentivize them. Why? So you can have these people who are millionaires and billionaires bring in all of their leftist workers and relocate and work in your state so that your conservative or conservative leaning state can now be leftist and advocate for socialism and all of the depravity that the left advocates for? Seems like a very strange thing. People who aren't going to fill your churches and aid into your community, who have a very different culture than you, even though they're still Americans. Let alone you want to bring in Europeans who despise Americans in most instances and fill them with your community, as opposed to Indians who are looking for a better life, who desire to be a part of the community that they're part of. I would say they're a little closer to Americans than Norwegians are. Now, do I want a ton of immigrants? Yeah, probably not. People who want to be here, absolutely, let them come. Who want to contribute to society, yeah, I think that's fair. Who have values similar, sure. Well, we have to look out for the nation's interest, not the world. Those who would have voted most for Trump in Europe will exclude Russia because there is absolutely no reason to even discuss bringing Russians into America. We don't want communism. Serbia, 67%. Georgia, 66%. Hungary, 62%. Bulgaria, 58%. Moldova, 56%. Slovakia, 52%. Slovenia, 51%. I don't hear Mr. What is his wonderful name? Bowtie Ranger advocating to bring those types of Europeans in. No, he wants the Nordic. He wants the blonde-haired, blue-eyed. Now, he has a racial motivation, which is very stupid and immature. But you just don't see that coming and being advocated for. There's no reason to. These people do not have an intelligent way of articulating their worldview. So then what's the point of all this? Well, the point of all of this is that you need to be able to understand what you want. I go back to what we started out with. If you want to achieve a goal, you have to understand why you want to achieve that goal, how you're going to get there, and where you currently are. If you want to buy a house and you're a millennial, you don't just complain that boomers own houses and say it's so expensive, more than what they paid for, and cry and whine about it, and then say, I can't buy a house. You form a plan, and you work towards that plan. God forbid you do that, because most of your parents, Gen X or boomers, whoever your parents were, mine were X, yours are boomers, it's fine, who cares? Didn't train you to have any sort of hard skin or to work for anything. They gave you everything that you wanted. You're entitled. That's why you vote in this leftist manner. That's why you believe that you are owed the property that they have. It's quite annoying. It's very immature. It's very childish. You need to grow up. And part of growing up is figuring out what you want and how you're going to get there from where you are currently. So here's 12 wonderful questions, and I guess I debate giving them all to you. But why not? This is how we'll close. These are the 12 questions that you should ask. This is part of my personal finance curriculum, if you will, that I teach and do seminars for. So if you're interested, reach out. Love to do that for churches, nonprofits, businesses as a benefit, whatever, military, anything like that, to help communities and help people understand how to run their finances and grow them. So here's the 12 questions that you have to ask yourself that I'm going to give you. Who do you need to support? This is applicable for anyone, whether it's for someone who's going to be entering college and is 14 years old, looking at what college life is going to look like and figuring out what life is going to look like and planning for that. And I got a small allowance now. Someone who is my age, 30, has a family, doesn't have a family. Someone who is working full time, someone who's retired, someone who is retired and is looking at downsizing or anything like that. Doesn't matter. This is applicable for anyone who even touches or smells a dollar, kind of a deal. So number one, who do you need to support? This could be someone. This could be no one. Number two, who do you owe? As in, what do you have that is a loan, essentially? What do you owe per month? Who do you owe? 3, what do you need to make? this is all financial, right? 4, what do you want to do? Very important question. 5, where do you want to be? You want to be out in the middle of friggin' nowhere, Kansas? Salina? Liberal, Kansas? You want to be out Manhattan, Kansas? You want to be living there? Where do you want to live? You want to be in Scottsdale, Arizona? You want to be in Beverly Hills? It's going to be a different plan depending on where you want to be. 6, who do you want to help? A lot of people don't think about that. Who do you want to help? Friends, family, church? Is there a cause that you're close to, near and dear to your heart? 7, how will you get there? How will you get to any of these pieces? What does that look like? What is the process of moving from where you currently are now to those? 8, how are you tracking your progress? Very important. How do you know you're going to achieve a goal if you're not tracking your progress? 9, what happens when you're done? Or excuse me, what happens when you're gone? Now, you can look at that like from an elderly perspective or from like a succession perspective of ensuring that your assets are given to someone or you have a will or trust established. But what about when you're gone from where you are? If you're a teenager, what happens when you move out? What happens when you're gone? What happens when you move out of your parents' house? What happens when you move out of your starter home? 10, what will you leave behind? Now, this is definitely more legacy focused. What will you leave behind? To your kids, to your community? 11, what is your motivation? That is highly important to understand your motivation. Motivation determines if your plans are going to be successful or not. If you are motivated, you have a much higher likelihood of achieving what you set out to do. If you're not motivated, it's not intrinsic, nope. And 12, perhaps the most important piece of setting goals and plans, when do you want to succeed? Now, in general, that probably should be like a now kind of an answer. But for each of the things that you start to set out for, put a timeline to it. You got to have an end date. If you want to buy a house by, 2027 or before you're, before you're 35, great. Put that timeline on it and then figure out, backwards engineer how you're going to get there. What do you need to save? What do you need to watch for? What do you need to educate yourself on? What do you need to do with your job? What do you need to do with your expenses? So on and so forth. All very important questions. And they're going to help you actually move from a victim mentality, if you'll, actually move forward with it, to achieving your goals and being successful. And that's going to be fantastic. It's good for society. It's good for you. It's good for everyone. If you're pursuing after wholesome things, right? There are many people in history who had very bad intentions, who pursued after things with a plan. So you have to ensure that what you're pursuing after is moral and is good. So, I think we've dispelled some myths. Let's see where we're coming in at, just over an hour. I think we've dispelled some myths, and gone through a lot of things that people are talking about today who have concerns, who are making big deals and being victims about nothing they should be victims about, really addressing ignorance that exists and hopefully providing you with some things to think about on how to move forward with getting where you want to actually be. Because if you ain't planning, what are you doing? If you ain't strategizing and moving forward, what are you doing? Just sitting around. That ain't good. Get out of your mom's basement, Go buy a house. Figure out how you're going to get there. Get off Twitter or Instagram. Stop crying about life. It's kind of that simple. But it's not. Because you actually have to do your actions and follow through with them. So, God bless you. Until next time, I hope this was edifying to you. My prayers are for you, and I look forward to our next time of connecting.